table starts to tip over.
People would love that.
You can't put both books on the same side.
I know, it'd break.
Jack throws it on the line so he doesn't get hurt.
So, where are we, Ryan?
You're in my hometown now.
No. This isn't the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center, as we've been doing it for the last 6 months.
Your green screen technology is amazing.
Oh yeah, yeah. It projects the that pre-20th century feeling very well.
Feels like we're actually there.
Yeah. Where are we?
So we are at Independence Seaport Museum, home of the cruiser Olympia.
And this is right across the river from Battleship New Jersey.
Yep, we're in Philadelphia, right across the river, within a half a mile of the Battleship New Jersey. So it was no commute at all for me.
Why did you drag me here? Out of Virginia to this armored Victorian living room, Ryan.
Well, you know how I keep getting into arguments on the internet about what certain types of ships are and aren't?
You? Me? Getting into arguments about ship types on the internet?
So, what is a cruiser?
I think it could be whatever you wanted it to be, really.
That seems to be how people take the term.
We'll get into that question in depth in just a minute after the intro and sponsor message. This episode of the Portholes podcast is brought to you by Wargaming.net and their brand new book, Cruisers, Naval Legends. This incredible coffee table size book is an illustrated history of cruisers. I'll put some video from Wargaming up on the screen, but if you can see that this is an incredible work that depicts cruisers all the way from Olympia, where we're sitting today, through to the large cruiser projects of the Cold War. This book, at the time of filming, is on pre-order, and that will go till roughly the end of December. When this episode airs, you should be able to go to the World of Warships website and order your copy. From what I can tell, copies start shipping in May. So if you have any interest in cruisers and you like the ships in World of Warships, perhaps think about getting a copy for yourself. As always, too, I have to throw in the Naval Institute plug, but Friedman U.S. Cruisers is also a great option if you have, there you go, thank you, Ryan, if you're interested in the subject matter we're talking about today. So let's get back to the episode. All right, Ryan, what's a cruiser?
Well, when are we talking about?
Whenever. So first off, let's dive into just a little bit of history here, so we can understand where cruisers come from. So we first pick up the term cruiser sort of in the post-war, at least in the U.S. Navy. From I believe France and Great Britain had used this term before. But so we have frigates in during the Civil War, steam frigates. And then post-Civil War, we build a new all-steel steam frigate, so to speak, but we can't call it that. So now we have to build what is a new class of ship, which becomes cruiser, this sort of larger general-purpose ship. We had ironclads, obviously Monitor and then Virginia on the Confederate side. And they were specialized vessels, and they did their role in advanced technology. But now we're talking about this new type of warship.
And it's interesting because they're filling the same roles as older sailing type ships. And they're just using the slang names for that. So you've got the full-size, slow gun ships, the ships of the line, become the line of battleships. The battleships. They're slow, form a line, fight the enemy fleet. And then you've got the sloops of war, the frigates, that are called cruisers, like collectively with a Z. Cruisers. And then they evolve more or less into these armored ships like Olympia. They're fulfilling the same role, even if their design legacy isn't a straight line.
Mm-hmm. And then, so by the time you do get to Olympia, you have this large for the time, armored warship that resembles almost a pre-dreadnought battleship. And for a time there is one of the most powerful vessels, in the U.S. fleet, certainly. And then even still, a few years on, is still a relatively powerful warship. And then we get into, as we get closer to after the sort of dreadnought era comes and goes, so now so the dreadnought battleships and the various classes that come from there. So now cruisers are undergoing sort of a similar evolution. And then you start to see, I think you mentioned liking the Omahas.
Oh, I love the Omahas.
You love some 4-stack ships?
More smokestacks, more better. That's what I always say.
Exactly. So then Omaha then becomes like the scout cruiser that you get up to sort of right up against the naval treaties right there in the interwar period. And then obviously there's additional evolution from there. And that's kind of where I want to pick up.
Yeah, and the cruisers really are performing two types of roles up into World War II, and that's when their roles really start to change. But up until then, it is scouting for the fleet and trade route protection, either commerce raiding or protecting trade routes.
The original purpose of the Lexington-class battle cruisers was scout cruiser, believe it or not. You have a ship that size with that gun caliber, and this is a scout cruiser. I think it just goes to show that the U.S. Navy was not really sure what it was doing or even how it defined the cruiser role.
And that's why we have such a hard time defining cruisers, because in these periods of transition, you go a long period of time without fighting any traditional battles. You don't know what the role of the ship is going to be. And you cannot experiment with your full-sized battleships. Those are very conservative, especially in the U.S. Navy.
Especially, 2 at a time. As we change, very, very evolutionary versus sort of the revolution that
cruisers
ships go on. Yeah,
are only one size down, but they're cheaper. You can experiment with them a lot. So you end up throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall to see what'll stick, and some of them get super large, like the Lexingtons. Some of them get super small, like the colonial cruisers, the Erie and Charleston, and both of those are cruisers.
Right. And so at that time, though, still very general purpose. We touched on this back in the very first episode when we talked about Alaska, where when we did our sort of naming convention here on the classes of ships, CV, cruiser aviation. So cruiser is still general enough to where if we scrape the superstructure off and put a flight deck on it, and it can carry airplanes, that's what a cruiser is. It's an aviation carrying cruiser, and then that sort of line continues on until eventually carriers sort of become their own class, and when airplanes become powerful enough for that sort of power projection versus just scouting like we just discussed, and suddenly now CVs have come into their own.
Yep, they're performing the role of cruisers in that they're scouting for the fleet. They evolved from the hulls of cruisers. The armored cruisers get the first aircraft on them, even before World War I, or before the United States enters World War I. And then the battle cruisers are largely what are converted into successful carriers. A couple of battleships get converted, but they're not nearly as successful.
Then what about like during World War II, the Japanese taking that one step further and saying the cruiser is still going to provide the aircraft scouting for the fleet. So then you end up with ships like Tone, where you build this really almost hyper-specific cruiser with its all-gun forward layout and the catapults on the back, so that that cruiser and those planes can provide that scouting that you don't want your carriers to do. But then by the time the war comes to an end, that ship is so specialized that it can't really step backward and fulfill sort of a more general purpose cruiser role. So then it just ends up sitting around and fuel shortages, obviously, and everything, and then just gets sunk anyway. which it probably would have if it had gone out.
A jack of all trades is a master of none.
There you go.
But Tone probably has the most capability of any cruiser. With the massive aviation scouting, the ability to take on capital ships with its torpedoes, the ability to take on other cruisers and smaller ships and do screening with its 8-inch guns, the anti-aircraft capabilities.
Yeah.
Like, there are a lot of roles you could plug that ship into, but there are other ships that do that each of those roles better.
Do you think so? Since we're talking about the Japanese, do you think that their role, that the Japanese doctrine, best uses cruisers as a part of sort of the grand battle, the great battle strategy, as far as being arming the cruisers with torpedoes, and they fill this really specific role, whereas maybe other nations know that they have to have cruisers, but then don't really know how to use them?
As a part of their larger pre-war strategy, the doctrine that they're building their fleet around, the Japanese probably develop cruisers to the highest extent in the interwar years.
And we, a couple episodes ago, we touched on Graf Spee. And I think, and then a couple episodes before that, when we talked about what our favorite cruisers were, just for a little bit of fun, you mentioned, like, when I said that my favorite cruiser was Prince Eugen, for no real reason. Like, I think they look great. There's my reason. That's it. They don't need to be good ships. They don't need to have a successful career. It's just very pretty, and that's the answer that I'm sticking with. But to really answer the question now, the Germans, you touched on this in the previous episode, they don't really have a doctrine where, we need battleships, we need these cruisers, we need aircraft carriers, Graf Zeppelin, we have all these destroyers. The Germans want to be this larger fleet like the Royal Navy, but they can't, just like in World War I. So the Admiral Hippers are useless, right? I think you argued, Graf Spee and Deutschland and that class was much better.
They are built for a hyper-specific role as opposed to Tone. They only do commerce raiding. They're not great anti-aircraft. They're not great using aircraft to scout. But in commerce raiding, they put the fear of God into a commercial power like Great Britain.
And they did that on less barrels, obviously of a bigger caliber, but less tonnage. But they had a better secondary battery for what that's worth. They still had torpedoes. And those ships were born out of Weimar. That wasn't some Nazi mega project that we like to think of. That was a very good interwar cruiser.
The fact that they had restrictions on them forced them to innovate, forced them to develop a doctrine and specifically tailor that ship to that doctrine, because they didn't have infinite weight, resources, money.
You can only build so many of them. Yeah, and they had to be a certain size. Might as well get as much as you can. Do you think that was, given the tonnage restrictions, do you think that class of ship is probably one of the best examples of what we're talking about here? Or do you think there's another cruiser class that does a better job?
At commerce rating specifically?
Well, just in general, I think like the sort of best bang for buck based on tonnage and maybe size, armament. Is there another class of cruiser that you think in that period does a better job? And I guess, and that's hard to say because a better job, you're asking me if commerce rating is the mission here.
They didn't do a tremendous job at it because by the time they're actually used a couple years after their design.
Yeah, they only had a very short. Yeah, there was only a really short lifespan ultimately. What about, so let's get to the U.S. Navy.
Okay.
Because obviously that's what a lot of people are here for. Shout out. We got a request. Shout out to USS Birmingham, CL-62. A viewer had commented about that in one of the previous cruiser episodes, which was a Cleveland class light cruiser commissioned from 43 to 47, but not the full 4 years though. But we can talk about why that's interesting here in just a few minutes. So if you're watching, there's your Cleveland shout out. So for the U.S. Navy, we've obviously have had this conversation, but for U.S. Navy cruiser development, especially in the interwar period, our cruisers, I would say, do get very specialized in how we break them out into different categories. And you hinted on that before by like, okay, this is Atlanta's considered a cruiser.
Yeah.
But then Des Moines is a cruiser. And obviously there's a lot of space in between. So you want to touch on that?
Yeah, no, the U.S. Navy's an interesting case because we're always cruiser deficient. Mm-hmm. So we push a lot of the cruiser roles off onto destroyers. Mm-hmm. And we're cruiser deficient largely because Congress will only give us so much money. So we want the battleships. Give us the bling. Who cares about the basics? Just give us the bling. Mm-hmm. But then when we get into a war and we actually get the ability to make money, or the money to
build
ships, cruisers, you can build them relatively fast, especially compared to capital ships. Mm-hmm. Especially in the United States, where we can build them a lot quicker than other countries just because of the industrial capability. So key to the U.S. interwar strategy is always having several different designs on hand so that when the war actually starts, you can just be like, all right, all of these, start building them now.
Mm-hmm. And so the U.S. doesn't build up to its treaty limited cruiser tonnage. So that's why we can get away with building like a lot of the interwar treaty cruisers that we do get, especially as we get closer to Pearl Harbor. Some of those early light cruisers like Brooklyn, we get quite a few of those. Mm-hmm. And then obviously as the war kicks off, especially in 1942, a lot of those older cruisers, the treaty cruisers, whether heavy or light, take the real brunt of those early battles and a lot of that damage, while obviously the new battleships are coming on. And then, as you said, now we have to react and start building all these new cruisers because we weren't doing it before.
Yeah, in World War I, you had your dreadnought type battleships, and then you had your pre-dreadnoughts. Mm-hmm. So whenever you had something you needed a sacrificial ship, you sent in the pre-dreadnoughts because they're old and obsolete. World War II, the Washington Naval Treaties made us scrap all of our obsolete ships. Mm-hmm. The dreadnoughts are very limited, and we're not going to be able to build that many of them. If they aren't already under construction when the war starts, they're not going to get finished. Mm-hmm. So the cruisers are the sacrificial stopgap. And the U.S. Navy, in a lot of ways, uses them the way that we should be using battleships, in that we need to control this sea area. We're going to send these ships in. Mm-hmm. We need to escort these other capital ships during these major battles. We would absolutely do that with battleships if we had them. Mm-hmm. The few that we have that can keep up, we do. But
well, then, so that's a good point. When we do get battleships in like 42, 43, especially the new fast battleships, we start using them almost like cruisers.
Oh yeah,
and they're right there at the front. They're in the action in a way that maybe they shouldn't have been, especially considering how few and given the strength of the Japanese Navy still at that time. But like Massachusetts at Casablanca, like acting as the third heavy cruiser in that division, charging at the beach, taking shell fire from, and versus sitting in the back, providing sort of the longer range gun support that you might expect from a battleship, and taking torpedo or having torpedoes shot at it and having to shoot at French destroyers at near point blank range. And is that just a lack of doctrine on our part? Like, here we have these brand new fast battleships and a bunch of admirals who don't necessarily know what to do, so that we'll treat them like the cruisers that we always wanted, fast and heavily armed.
Yeah, I think the lack of doctrine is key there. We developed the cruiser doctrine for fast ships, and we had cruisers to play with, like you said. And also, nobody ever slapped us on the nose with a newspaper. Like, Massachusetts takes a hit, but it's mild.
Yeah.
Like the ships that we send into off Guadalcanal, really close quarters fighting where we had previously expended all of our cruisers. I mean, South Dakota gets chewed up, but it's nothing significant. But we never got hit in a major way during one of these battles that told us, that, oh, wait, we've got to rethink this.
Well, we did a video on Hailstone, Operation Hailstone, with New Jersey and Iowa. And Spruance taking these two brand new fast battleships.
Largely untrained. Tremendous risk.
And just hurling them around this atoll at basically full speed and taking torpedoes and everything else. And you're right. Like, just a little bit off, here and there, and Iowa gets torpedoed, or New Jersey. And then what would you do? Great, And someone bashes Spruance over the head with that newspaper. Like, thanks a lot.
A really well thought of cruiser admiral who stops and thinks and is really well regarded, and modern historians consider him one of our best admirals. We even elevate him above the Halseys, who attained more fame in wartime and more rank, for that matter. But yeah, for lack of doctrine, he charges in there, and it could have been disastrous, and that would have been the end of his career.
Do you so we've talked about this, obviously, are the Iowas battle cruisers? And I spoke with Bill Garsky again, interview in the corner here. I spoke with him again recently, and he said, oh yeah, when they were first being designed, very, very battle cruiser. And then obviously little tweaks here and there, and well, we don't really have doctrine for a spot for battle cruisers in our Navy, so it's a battleship, and just beef it up here and there and send it out.
And one of the preliminary designs, only armed against 8-inch guns, lots of speed and 16-inch guns for going and hunting cruisers. That is archetypical battle cruiser. But the Navy very rightly looks at that and says, this is archetypical battle cruiser. We got to go
get away from that. Yeah.
So they completely go in a different direction. Chantry, leading that design process, takes it to a more armored route. That they actually drop that whole design chain and go from the South Dakotas, a legitimate battleship class, and just start scaling that up.
What about, I don't even want to bring this up, but what about Alaska?
The cruiser Alaska?
Yes, the cruiser Alaska.
And built right across the river in Camden, New Jersey.
We like to maintain that Alaska is a large cruiser or a cruiser killer. It's built, as you said, as a reaction to certain information about Japanese large cruisers that never materialized. And it's not. It doesn't fit the standard World War II definition of a battle cruiser because gun caliber, and it does sort of sit in this gray area. But I think that's the whole point of this question. Like, what is a cruiser? Sort of a general purpose ship that's good at a lot of things. But I don't think Alaska does the battleship role all that well to fulfill the battle in the battle cruiser part. But that's interesting. And then, of course, you add in all the other large cruiser projects, especially as you get to the post-war period, like Stalingrad, that the Soviets are building. This idea that we tried battleships in World War II, couldn't make it happen. But the dictator in charge, as you've pointed out, dictators need big ships with big guns. So what's your take on Alaska again? Or large cruisers. Where do they fit in this cruiser world?
In my opinion, Alaska has one flaw. She would look so much better with 4 smokestacks instead of 1.
Oh Lord, here we go again.
Now, ships get larger over time. Classes of ships get larger over time. And they get to the point where they are so large and expensive, that it's such a symbol of national prestige that you can no longer risk them. So they lose all of their military value. So the next size down ship starts to expand and take over that role. And that is... Alaska is very much the next size down ship starting to expand to the maximum, now that we are free of all restrictions.
And let's touch back again on the idea that the U.S. Navy builds so many different types of cruisers. Let's just look at World War II here really quickly. So many different types of cruisers and all different size. So you got to think, in 1945, just as an example, well, actually, let's expand that to 1947. You're wearing your Salem, you're wearing your Salem jacket, sweatshirt. So let's include them. So we have in this period, right, from 45 to 47, right at the end of the war, we have Atlantas, which are, still cruisers, but basically just larger destroyers.
And if you expand it a little bit earlier, you've got Erie and Charleston being commissioned in, 1936 or 1937, and they're 6-inch armed, 2,000-ton cruisers, colonial cruisers that are trying to fill a stopgap because the London Navy Treaty limits cruiser tonnage.
So you have those at 2,000 tons, Atlanta, and then other older light cruisers, maybe still like some of the Brooklyns, Cleveland's, the sort of the newer generation of light cruisers.
Yeah, legitimate full-size light cruisers.
And then, of course, all the heavy cruisers, all the old ones, plus, the Baltimores and all the variations of the Baltimore that we've talked about. And then, so you get to that, and then now we have a ship the size of Alaska, and then you have coming out a ship the size of Des Moines, which is like the size of North Carolina. And depending on, and while Des Moines maybe still has a traditional cruiser role and cruiser armor belt, still fast, and that new gun system, that new automatic gun system is pretty incredible in terms of putting. Someone mentioned in a comment too, in one of those episodes, talking about shell weight and the idea that, well, if you can put a certain shell weight downrange, okay, well then it becomes a battleship. So some people were saying, well, Alaska can be called a battle cruiser because it can put certain shell weight downrange. And then I go, well, but Des Moines can put out 4 or 5 salvos in that same period of time, and an 8-inch shell is not small and insignificant either. So could you look at it in that regard? So I'm not calling Des Moines a battleship, and no one wants to call Des Moines battle cruisers because, again, we're very focused on the idea that it has 8-inch guns, so it's just a heavy cruiser.
I did the math once to see I can't remember if it was a 1-minute period of time, a 5-minute period of time, whether an Iowa class or a Des Moines class could put out more weight of shell. And in theory, the Iowa class puts out like fractionally more, just a couple of pounds more weight of shell, firing those big 2,700-pound projectiles. In practice, the Iowa class, they say they can fire 1 round every 30 seconds. In reality, it's 1 round every minute. Des Moines was able to achieve and sustain their rate of fire in practice. So Des Moines might have the highest output in weight of shell of any American ship ever built. It's certainly bigger than Alaska's. So it's certainly the most of any cruiser.
And so in the post-war period, where suddenly you don't really need the battleship's big guns. So immediately when the war ends, practically all the battleships, even new battleships, like all the South Dakotas, are immediately just mothballed, and that's it. And only the Iowas are retained because they're the newest and the biggest and most capable, and are able to be sort of expanded later on.
And 3 of the 4 Iowas are decommissioned alongside the North Carolinas and South Dakotas.
Yeah. And then obviously we've discussed like Illinois and Kentucky, this idea that, okay, we have unfinished hulls, the various King Nimitz designs. Okay, can we finish them off as these new style of anti-aircraft battleships, but does that make them cruisers because they have 8-inch guns? So then you can go all the way down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, King and Nimitz had the wrong idea, taking 2 stacks down to 1. They should have taken it out to 4.
2 to 4?
Yeah.
Okay, more stacks, more better, right?
How else do you show that it's a fast battleship?
Just more exhaust, Okay, I gotcha. Yeah. Should they have been raked back like the French? So little,
Everything in moderation, Jack.
Oh, okay.
Just a little bit of rake.
Just a little bit of rake.
Like
okay.
equivalent to a 4-stack destroyer.
Okay. So okay, so and then with Des Moines then sticking around with that class, not just Des Moines herself, but they become these flagships because they are this incredibly capable platform, and maybe you don't need a battleship to fulfill that role because obviously if there's no one to shoot at.
Who else has battleships for us to shoot at?
Right. But Alaska is not retained. They don't. Obviously, they're kept around for a little while. Can we missile convert them? But they're big and they have big guns. Why aren't they retained for flag purposes?
Yeah, they're disposed around the same time they were getting rid of the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, the older battleships, while the Des Moines and the Iowas are kept in mothballs throughout that whole period. Yeah.
Is that the bridge between cruiser and battleship, the size of Alaska in terms of manpower and
well, certainly she is too resource intensive. Yeah.
Along the same lines, though, think about Worcester. So there you have a ship which is brand new, similar to Salem and Des Moines in that class, very capable, auto-loading guns. Also, I mean, obviously, I think they see some service in Vietnam or was it Korea?
I think just Korea.
Just Korea, yeah. And then they get pulled out very quickly, too, because they are over-specialized. They're 6-inch guns, while auto-loading, don't fulfill that great of a shore bombardment role and are not really that great against jets. Their whole purpose was to fill the sky full of 6-inch anti-aircraft rounds off the coast of Japan.
Can track propeller planes, less so jet aircraft. And I also wonder just how effective their autoloaders were.
Well, the elevation, like the whole mechanism is even more complicated than even Salem's because of the elevation requirements. I think their guns could practically point straight up or near to it.
I have to suspect that there was some sort of fatal flaw with those ships that they would be decommissioned that quickly. And the fatal flaw with the Alaskas is that they're so manpower intensive. The Worcesters are not that manpower intensive. They are the right size for a cruiser to survive, but they don't. So there's got to be some other fatal design flaw.
Well, again, I think they have this. They were built specifically for one purpose, and when that purpose no longer existed, they couldn't adapt to anything else. And then you have like Des Moines, you have a brand new, extremely sophisticated ship, but unlike Des Moines, it couldn't be translated into a new role.
That's a good point. They're smaller than the Des Moines, so that you can't strip those guns off and put something new on them the way that we do with the Clevelands, like Little Rock, the Baltimores, like Chicago, the Des Moines. The Navy planned to do something similar to the Iowa class conversion in the 80s to the Des Moines.
And then as we get further into the Cold War, which is something that we don't like to touch on. We very much World War II people here, and I feel like a lot of the audience is. But there's a lot of Cold War veterans out there, and obviously, as you've talked about in your videos, New Jersey is, she's depicted in her last form, her 1980s form. So you're telling that particular story. Obviously, a lot of people are like, "Well, put it back to World War II." It's, well, I can't. You got 5-inch 38 sitting around somewhere in your shed that I can bolt back on. And so let's talk about that a little bit. The term frigate reappears,
which initially sort of means cruiser again, and then that.
I think because those definitions of cruiser were so well known and sort of depicted in World War II. Well, now cruisers don't have 8-inch guns. Obviously, you still have some Baltimores, and they're slowly being converted to missile cruisers. But now there's this gray area, this confusion about what a cruiser is again.
We get back into this area where we're not fighting naval wars anymore. So we don't know what we need. We've got to experiment in a lot of different directions. And so new names come out, and they tend to be older names or archaic forms of the names, much like a frigate was nicknamed a cruiser with a Z. So now that we've developed this new class of ships, we'll call it the cruiser. Well, now we've gone the other way.
And even today, I mean, everyone, when we see in the news another Ticonderoga class missile cruiser being decommissioned. Well, they served their purpose. They've had their 30 plus years, or however long that they've been in service. But let's not forget that hull form is shared with some variation with Arleigh Burke, and those are destroyers. But Arleigh Burke fills a cruiser mission if you think about it.
Well, yeah, what is the mission of a destroyer versus the mission of a cruiser? Destroyers traditionally do anti-submarine warfare. Cruisers sort of evolved out of the scouting role because aircraft and drone satellites have taken that over, and commerce raiding isn't really a thing anymore. Submarines took that role. So the new roles of cruisers are anti-aircraft warfare, really screening the aircraft carriers and
Launching
with their missiles,
cruise missiles,
the shore bombardment role that the battleships fulfilled for a while.
So is the whole idea of ship naming classes now obsolete because you have aircraft carriers, you have submarines. Those are obviously they are what they are. But now you have a ship that's roughly the size of a late World War II sort of light heavy cruiser that fulfills all the roles. And then now with a new class of frigate on the way, class coming, wouldn't they be more suited for the destroyer name almost? I'm just thinking like cruisers are what you make of them.
Yeah, no.
And the politics we've already touched on this, but the politics behind naming conventions, the Russian Navy needing everything to be cruisers because that's what large navies have, and we need to look big especially in the Cold War. And then obviously, the U.S. is we have we've applied this name to this large range of classes of ships. So, that's very.
It's another example of the growth. The battleship started at 10,000 tons. You could build a fleet of 30 of them. Within 50 years, they were 50 to 70,000 tons, the new competitive ones. And if you could build 2 or 4 of those, you were the best Navy in the world. And then cruisers did the same thing. They start out at a couple thousand tons with 4-inch guns, and they grow up to Alaska.
I want to circle back to. So we just mentioned politics and the idea that we need cruisers because that's what navies have, or we need battleships because that's what dictators like. So you have. Let's circle back to interwar Germany here just for a moment. So you get the Deutschlands, and you get then the design study that evolves and morphs into the Scharnhorst class. Obviously, then the rise of the Nazi Party, and then they kind of finish it off. And then we've already talked about the Admiral Hippers. So Germany wanting to build this conventional sort of navy around battleships, cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and even aircraft carriers. The Graf Zeppelin episode is coming. I promise. Someone asked for that too, and I promise you that. We'll get around to that in the next round of filming, and we'll talk about what Graf Zeppelin is. Is that an armored light cruiser with a flight deck that's also the size of a battleship? Yeah, exactly. What is it? 4x4. So is it 16 6-inch guns? Okay. So it can be whatever you want it to be. But so back to Germany really quickly. Had we focused on commerce rating and not playing Navy so much, so if we don't get the Admiral Hippers, and we go the large cruiser commerce raider line if we just keep that going, and you get to things. So now you're beyond Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and you get O class, in my opinion, a true World War II contemporary battle cruiser.
Yeah,
Actually, battle cruiser. I still maintain, I think you and I would both agree that they all get sunk anyway. But at least the doctrine is there.
Yeah, it was a fleet that needed to do commerce raiding, designed around commerce raiding. But Germany is the perfect example of politics dictating what ships are called. World War I Germany, because the appropriations come from two different directions, their battle cruisers are called gross cruisers, great cruisers, so they can get cruiser appropriation versus their battleships, their slash ships get the battleship appropriations. So the name, they're battle cruisers and battleships for sure, but they have to call them different things just to pass it through whatever their equivalent of Congress was at the time. And then, likewise, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are easy to debate what they are, much like Alaska.
Oh, yeah, we've had that conversation. Yeah, exactly.
It's a perfect microcosm of the growth in 2 generations. You start with a 12,000-ton cruiser, and you end up with a 35,000-ton called a battleship right after it, same size guns. They started out both as these armored cruiser commerce raider type ships.
And so with that being said, what is a cruiser? I think as we've discussed now, a cruiser can be whatever you want it to be. I think obviously battleships have their special place. There's a certain amount of gun caliber and armor thickness and dimension there. Obviously, aircraft carriers evolve out of cruisers to become their own class. And especially now in the modern age, what's a cruiser? What even is a destroyer?
Well, yeah,
anymore?
Cruisers are now non-existent. There's a handful of them out there, but they'll be gone in our lifetime. And the destroyers have grown from a couple hundred tons to a couple thousand tons to now they're cruiser size.
But if Congress got an itch tomorrow, and shout out to Drakenfell, who loves making fun of the U.S. Congress in his videos. If Congress tomorrow came up and said, we just feel like stirring things up a bit, renamed all the Arleigh Burke class ships cruisers, and then named this new Constellation class frigate a destroyer.
I don't think Congress could agree to do that.
No.
Because
that would imply them being able to come to a solution and a consensus about something. Yeah, you're right.
And you've got a big argument of, do we want to use this now obsolete name, cruiser, battleship for that matter, on a ship class that is not obsolete?
But does that make the Navy look bigger? And because China is building, China has cruisers in the same way that I think maybe Russia had cruisers. This idea that we have this ocean, we have this blue water navy that we have to, this power projection, and we have to make it look like we know what we're doing. So navies have cruisers, so we need cruisers, even though they might not be any bigger or more capable than an Arleigh Burke. So,
well, the smaller navies that are trying to become top tier and trying to project power need that sort of thing. The larger navies that are trying to maintain dominance do not need that. In fact, we need to say that, this is a much smaller type of ship, much cheaper, very, very small, not going to cause anybody to stir the pot or anything.
Okay. Well, with that being said, what is a cruiser? We'll leave it up to you all in the audience, and you can debate this down in the comments below. Let us know what you think, and go back and check out the other episodes where Ryan and I talk a little bit more in depth about each individual topic that we've covered today. And again, big thank you to USS Olympia and what's the museum?
Independence Seaport Museum.
Seaport Museum, and World of Warships and their new cruiser book. Again, this will be available to order now and shipping in May. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ryan. This was always a pleasure here in the Victorian living room.
Thanks for making the long drive up here to see us.
Absolutely. This was a lot of fun. Thanks.